resume.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Today we are back with a panel of witnesses dealing with decision-making. You remember we excused Mr. Matthew last day, so we have Jerry Christensen and Wayne Saito back. And the first council, we left off with the province yesterday or last time, and I think we're starting with Canada now.
Mr. Commissioner, for the record, Hugh McCauley for the Government of Canada. I'll be very brief. Dr. Christensen, early in your testimony, you described the Sportfish Advisory Board as having a wide constituency. And I thought it might be helpful for Mr. Commissioner and the rest of us just to take a quick look at the terms of reference for the SFAB. If I could have Mr. Len, that's number 2 on Canada's list of documents. First, Dr. Christensen, are these the current terms of reference for the SFAB?
Yes, they are.
And Mr. Len, if we could go to page 3, near the bottom, there's a long list of, I won't read all of the organizations that have representation on the SFAB, but is that the wide constituency that you referred to?
Yes, it's wide in two contexts. The attempt in the board is to, and it's part of the terms of reference in other places, is to represent both what is termed the primary sector, which are ordinary people who like to go fishing, and the secondary sector, which is composed of people whose economic interests lie in providing services to recreational angling. And so in that list you see the combination of that, Marine Trades Association, marine operators, Sport Fishing Institute as the secondary side, the primary side, BC Wildlife Federation, Federation of Drift Fly Fishers, etc. And each of these are entitled to representatives on the board. There are then, and I think it's 24 or 25 local committees at the present time. And in those local committees, in a sense, anyone who attends the meeting is usually part of it. And they are considered public meetings. People are entitled to attend. They vary a little bit in their composition for historical reasons, but each of those local committees selects people to become part of the regional of the North and South Regional Board, and each of those regional boards selects 7 to go become part of the main board, as well as other main board representatives who reflect these organizations, or as in my case, I am a part of the process because I am the SFAB nominee to be the salmon commissioner who represents the recreational sector interests.
Thank you, that's very helpful. In your view, does the SFAB provide an effective means for DFO to receive advice and input from the recreational fishing sector in British Columbia?
Yes, I do, and I would note that in most instances where this issue is being discussed, the SFAB is kind of cited as the paradigm. It would be, and this was true of when Stephen Owen and the University of Victoria people did their work. They indicated that the SFAB appeared to be a better mix of local and regional and intra-sectoral interests than had been possible with other sectors.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Mr. Saito, just a question about the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee. The terms of reference for that committee are already an Exhibit 342. I don't think I need them brought up, but the terms of reference provide for representation from the province of British Columbia on that committee. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, in an ex officio capacity.
And Mr. Saito, have you been that representative over the years?
I have.
In your view, does the IHPC, the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, provide an effective means for the province of British Columbia to provide its advice and input to DFO with respect to the management of Fraser sockeye fisheries?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. In your view, does the IHPC provide an effective means for the province of British Columbia to provide its advice and input to DFO with respect to Fraser sockeye fisheries?
It is an effective mean, yes.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Were you planning to mark the terms of reference, Mr. McCauley?
Oh.
Were you going to mark the terms of reference?
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, please, Mr. Registrar, if you could mark that as an exhibit, that would be great.
Exhibit number 421.
Thank you.
Hearing for Area B, Sainer, and Area D, Gillnet. I thank both gentlemen for returning. Just to put everything in context, because we are dealing with such a disjointed process where you're on and off from day to day. For the record, you first appeared on February the 1st and testified during a portion of that day. Is that not correct?
Yes, I believe that's true.
Yes, and then you carried on further as a panel on February the 3rd. Is that not correct?
If that's last Thursday, that's correct.
All right. Well, if Commission Council doesn't jump up, let's assume that to be the record. And today being your third appearance, just to put into context the areas that I want to focus on, you have been called to testify in part about the effectiveness of the consultative process. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
Yes, and part of that consultative process is obviously, in part, the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board, the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, and the Integrated Fishery Management Plan. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
And part of your testimony, both of you, related to the in-season decision-making after one has gone through the processes pre-season. Is that not correct?
That's right.
Right. And so appreciating all that, my cross-examination in part is focused on testimony that you gave over the last 2 days. Let's start with you, Dr. Christensen. There's an interesting exchange you had with various council, including Commission Council, about whether or not there is a need for technical assistance of the parties to have their own individual technical assistance in having input into the processes that we're speaking about, and in particular, the Integrated Harvest Planning Commission. You remember that testimony from last day?
I do.
Yes. And if I can correctly summarize what I understood you to be saying last day, you are not comfortable with to suggest that each of the parties coming before this committee should have their own technical advisors, correct?
That's correct.
Yes, and in the context of your concern or your opinion in that regard, you make the point, and I'm happy to take you to the transcript, but I don't think any of this is controversial. You said, and this would have been, just for the record, on the 1st of February, and it happens to be page 27. I'm just reading you one line, and I don't think it's even important for Mr. Lund to put it forward unless you want to see it. You said at line 32, and so, you know, my vision of the technical support is that a well-funded department with highly qualified staff does the primary technical work. And then you went on from there. Now, what I want to explore is, when you say a well-funded department doing this work, are you suggesting that that is the status quo? That is, in fact, the role that DFO is playing in providing the parties at this committee with the kind of technical assistance? Or is it that you're saying, look, well, I would opt for a well-funded department providing this technical assistance if they were well-funded, but right now they're not? What is your response?
Well, it's the latter. I mean, I believe that that's the way the system ought to operate, which is that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is funded well or adequately to provide the scientific research, the transition of that research into advice to management, and that information being available to all of the players to help make the best decisions. Do I think that the department is adequately funded? While I don't pretend to be an expert on, the balance that government should take in that context, it is obvious, I think, to anyone that the funds available to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Pacific region have been decreasing year by year as a result of constraint decisions taken in Ottawa, probably for important reasons, but that nonetheless, in terms of the amount of catch monitoring that goes on, the stock assessment work, the things that, in particular, that I deal with as Salmon Commissioner with a primary interest in Chinook, could we do better with more? My answer would be yes.
But coming back to the focus, when you recommend to this commission that, in your opinion, it would not be advisable for each of the parties, the constituent membership of the IHPC to have their own technical advisors. You say a well-funded department really should be providing that technical assistance. Is it your testimony that at this point in time that the DFO is not providing the necessary technical assistance for the parties to be well equipped to make decisions at that level?
I can only speak for the recreational sector. I can't make judgments on behalf of others. I think that by and large we do get good assistance from the department insofar as our sector is concerned. But I hasten to add that I think that the basic amount of data that's available is not adequate. It's for that reason, for example, as a private individual, I sit on the board of the Pacific Ocean Shelf Tracking Project and have been trying to persuade government to fund that project so that there would be more scientific information available.
But recognizing the department is not well funded, do you recognize that at this point in time the parties generally are not provided with adequate technical assistance to make the kind of decisions that you're being called upon to make?
Well, I don't think I would be that categoric about it. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm equipped to judge the level of technical assistance. I was really trying to address a somewhat different issue. I guess I am concerned that that when advisory bodies become composed of people who are there to argue the policy issues on behalf of their constituencies, then feel the need to bring in their own technical advisors so that the forum becomes a war between competing technical advisors. I personally find that that's not helpful, and hence my belief that our sector is better served when that technical advice is coming from an impartial body, the Department of Fisheries Oceans, and we aren't placed in a position where each of us is suspicious of the other constituency's technical advisors, because, hey, we know he who pays the piper calls the tune.
Yes, but to avoid that kind of process that you find unacceptable, your position is really predicated upon DFO being well enough funded to provide the kind of technical assistance that the parties will require in a collective way at the committee. Is that not correct?
I would agree with that, yes.
Just of interest, Mr. Sato, do you have any comments to make in respect to this exchange I've just had with Dr. Christensen?
Well, open questions like this are difficult.
Well, I'm only inviting you if you feel that you have a contribution you'd like to make.
And thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I believe that specific advice to the sectors also has value. There's a fine balance to be struck between the objectivity and the level of professionalism that DFO staff would have to maintain to be freely and openly available to all sectors, versus specific questions being answered or answers being provided to specific questions to a specific sector. Have had the good fortune, perhaps, of experiencing that at the international level as well as within the IHPC, and that there are questions that sometimes are very specific to the interests of a recreational fishing sector or commercial or marine conservation or perhaps First Nations. That sometimes it's the slant, it's the interpretation or the that is of importance, because there are always and often are options to consider. I can't disagree with Dr. Christensen that if DFO were to be fully funded and were to maintain a high level of neutrality and objectivity, I think that would be the perfect system.
Believe that the members of the IHPC all have a grasp of the complex issues that they're facing them and asking for decisions?
Well, I think I probably would be offending people if I said yes or no, quite frankly, because I think there's a broad range of experience and capacity within the participants within the IHPC. I mean, that said, there are also the main job, I think, from the technical perspective, is to provide an interpretation of biological processes or data and information that exists, and to provide that information or that interpretation on some sort of logical, sensible basis, so that we can understand that in common everyday terms, so to speak. And I think that's an important function to perform. My sense of this is that within the IHPC and other process like that not everybody has that ability to either hear and make that translation or interpretation, and I think that's an important job of the technical people, is to provide that interpretation service.
Right, but those comments, your comments just now, are with the backdrop of evidence that you gave previous days of some concerns that you have about the process, and in particular you spoke about fatigue, and I'm happy to lead you to the transcript if you wish to be reminded. You spoke about diminishing resources, financial resources being withdrawn. You are concerned, are you not, about the process remaining valid and effective in the context of the concerns that you have previously testified about? Is that not correct?
Well, I am concerned on behalf of, or representing perhaps the individuals that are participating in these processes, and that it isn't just one process. It is well, I don't know if there is evidence to suggest how many processes there are, but one merely kind of needs to look at and examine the number of meetings, pre-season planning meetings that the participants in the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process are expected to participate in, and to maintain that level of familiarity and competency, so to speak, or dare I say, with respect to the large number of issues, complex issues that need to be maintained, that the Department of Fisheries is looking for advice on, so they can develop a sound, robust fishing plan. Yeah, it's really hard work. I mean, I've been in this business, or had been in this business for over 35 years, and I too have a very difficult time kind of keeping up with all the complex issues. So yeah, meeting fatigue and participation fatigue is a very real issue, to make sure that everybody, all the processes are well serviced by well-funded and properly equipped advice. That's a tall order.
Your remarks are of importance to my clients in light of the fact that they will be testifying during the commercial fisheries section of this inquiry on these very questions of the demands that are put upon them through all these consultative processes. So that is why I have asked you for your comments. The next thing to ask you is this. My clients instruct me that in respect to, for example, the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, that where issues arise where no consensus is achieved, that these issues are just swept off the table. In other words, they end up without any resolution because a consensus has not been reached. Do you generally agree, from your observations, both of you, that that appears to be, unfortunately, the modus operandi of the beast, that it obviously cannot resolve matters where there are interests colliding and where consensus cannot be reached?
Certainly, it is, of course, the nature of I guess from my perspective, this was a new experiment by the department, the creation of a consensus-based decision-making forum, and obviously then where there is no consensus, the question is left as to how the department will act. My view of it, frankly, has been that there haven't been many occasions upon which there has been an attempt to find a consensus. Rather, that the value of the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee has been that it allows each of the sectors to flag and discuss the issues which are important to them, to inform the department as to what those issues are, and to elicit comment from their colleagues or opponents or others, however you wish to view it. And in that context, the department receives information and advice from the sectors, and then of course it has to make a decision. I think it would be unrealistic to think that in the crafting of fishing plans in British Columbia, that indeed you could do that by consensus. Because the reality is that the issues, there are often zero-sum games in which one person wins and the other loses, and it's not a simple process.
Is Mr. Sato anything to say in this regard?
Part of my problem, I guess, or the observation I guess I'd make in responding to your question, sir, is that I don't know precisely what happens to these sorts of issues when consensus is not reached. Quite frankly, I'm not entirely sure what happens when consensus is reached, because there have been instances where consensus was reached within the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process, and I be absolutely candid, I don't know what happened to that advice with respect to did it reach the minister's desk or the ultimate decision maker's desk for resolution, and if so, how was that treated? So the larger question I guess I'd have is that while there are agenda items within the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee process, I think topics are discussed. From time to time, consensus is reached. From time to time, consensus is not reached. But what happens to that after that point is not that transparent.
Well, in fact, Dr. Christensen, we do know that when consensus is reached, it doesn't necessarily get acted upon, as reference to your testimony of last day, wherein consensus was reached on a recommendation to the DFO for the waiver of license fees during the rough period of, I believe, approximately 07 to 09, and that never got acted upon. Is that not an example where consensus was reached and yet not acted upon?
Yeah, exactly. And indeed, I think that one of the more charming notions that has been exercised by people in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in recent years is the notion that somehow consensus is going to make things easier. That, if only all of those interests would reach consensus, then it would be easier for the politicians to make a decision. And frankly, I think that the evidence suggests that's simply not true, and that this one of licensed stuff is an example. If I could use an example outside strictly the salmon area, the department instituted a process 2 years ago called the Gordon process under consultant Victoria on halibut allocation. A consensus was reached by commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, First Nations, the province, and it was rejected in Ottawa. And the reason, of course, was obvious. It cost money, and the government decided that it didn't have any money. But the notion that reaching a consensus decision is going to make things easier, I think, is frankly a little bit naive.
Thank you. I want to focus now a little bit on the in-season decision-making. We certainly have learned that there is not a structured process for DFO to pursue with interest groups or stakeholders when making in-season decisions. Am I accurate in at least saying that?
Yes, I believe that's accurate.
Now, I may be the only one perplexed with this in this room, so please forgive me, but I'm not quite understanding to what extent DFO believes that they are obligated to consult with stakeholders when making in-season decisions. Now, neither of you are with DFO at the present time. Do you have your own perspective as stakeholders? Do you expect as a stakeholder that when decisions are being made in season, there is some form of consultative process?
Well, that certainly is the wish and hope of the Sport Fishing Advisory Board, and I think the evidence is that that is the way the department tries to operate. In I mean, there are active in-season consultations take place in northern British Columbia with respect to the fisheries in that area, and in southern British Columbia during the fishing season. Does consultation always take place? No. And, you know, the most recent Sport Fishing Advisory Board meeting this last weekend, one of the issues on the table were some decisions that were made by enforcement staff during the season in an attempt to change the harvesting rule with respect to what size hook you could use, and where a decision was made without local consultation, which immediately led, of course, to friction. And indeed, the decision of the meeting was that the department wants to include representatives of the advisory board with its internal committee, which is looking at the range of issues in order to ensure that that problem doesn't recur next season. So, I mean, my view is that the department does try to consult with our sector, at least, in season. I can't speak to what goes on with respect to the commercial sector.
And not to the prejudice of having to make expeditious decisions in season. You feel that the level of consultation is appropriate, and it has not in any way prejudiced the need of DFO to sometimes turn on a coin.
No, and I think, again, I suspect the situation is different for the commercial sector. The commercial sector is dealing with harvesters with much higher fishing power who are, particularly in the case of sockeye, accessing stocks that are moving through the system very quickly and where decisions are of great urgency in a particular moment. The recreational sector, right, by and large, is not subject to the same set of pressures.
Yes, and I believe this commission is likely to hear evidence from my clients in that regard. Mr. Sato, do you have any remarks to make? And I invite you to make your remarks not only in the context of a current member of the Ministry of the Environment provincially, but also from your experience previously with DFO.
Well, I think my comments probably would be the same regardless, sir, but the observation, I guess, that I have is not too dissimilar to Dr. Christensen's in the sense that the Department of Fisheries has done a remarkable job of following through or honoring their commitment to consult on a bilateral basis with the interest groups or sectors. I think they do as good a job as resources and time permits. I think that in season, I don't envy the role of some of my former colleagues in that their days are not 37 and a half hours a week. It's many more hours a week than that, simply because the technical issues, as well as consulting and informing, keeping the client groups that they're charged with the responsibility of keeping informed, maintain that process. There is also the Fraser River panel process is a model where not only is that bilateral relationship maintained, but there's also that special relationship with all of the interests that are at least represented within the Fraser River panel, where all the interests are around one table within the Canadian section that have the ability to hear the issues that are being presented to all the groups together, and perhaps some opportunity to resolve some of those issues and different potential differences that might arise, and to give each other mutual support. And that doesn't exist. I mean, to put it in the positive, that is a special process for Fraser River sockeye that, quite frankly, other processes could benefit from, in the sense that there are more than one group at any one time that are being informed of, briefed on, and perhaps consulted with regarding opportunities that might arise or issues that might arise in season.
We have heard evidence that for in-season changes to the integrated harvest management plan, I believe it's got to go to the minister in Ottawa. Is that not correct, Mr. Sato or Dr. Christensen?
It's my understanding that that is indeed the case, or if a situation is not described in the integrated IFMP, Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, then that is not an option that is easily considered by Department of Fisheries managers.
Assuming Dr. Christensen agrees with you, do either of you know of any obstacles that DFO has encountered in terms of changing the integrated fishery management plan because they couldn't get the ministerial approval in Ottawa? Do you know of any delays in decision-making because of what I'll call bureaucratic obstacles?
I am not aware of any in the context of the recreational fishery, and I think that's probably because the integrated plan pretty much describes all of the range of possibilities that are there. So I'm frankly not aware of any case where there was a requirement to seek ministerial approval for a change in the recreational plan.
In the recreational plan.
Yeah.
But you are aware, are you not, that there was a ministerial approval in terms of changing the plans 2010 on the commercial fishery?
Yeah, I can't speak with any expertise at all.
Fair enough. Mr. Sato, do you have anything to add?
Well, I can't authoritatively state that I've seen that in action, particularly in 2010, and that my participation is a step or two removed from that.
Yes. Mr. Sato, in your testimony on either the 1st or the 3rd of this month, you spoke about the concept of an arbitration system in resolving some disputes, and I believe your suggestion or testimony related to in-season disputes. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
Right. Because that's on record, I just want to explore that a bit more with you, because frankly I'm a little skeptical that it would work, and I'm interested in your responses. Do you, first of all, you do recognize that a lot of these in-season disputes require very expeditious decision-making. Is that not correct?
That's absolutely correct.
And that being the case, in floating out the idea to the Commission of an arbitration, I very much appreciate your trying to be helpful to everybody and at least throw new ideas out on the floor. Do you truly believe that an arbitration system could be struck and could be hearing these issues as expeditiously as the decisions would call for?
In reality, sir, it already exists. It simply is not formalized, and it occurs on a bilateral basis. In season, if issues or respectful differences of opinion or not respectful differences of opinion were to arise, the lobbying or the phone calls or the process basically is to approach a fisheries manager and to seek satisfaction. If that satisfaction is not reached, then you escalate the issue to the next level, and to the next level until such point where at some point a senior official within the Department of Fisheries has to take the pleadings or the lobbying or what have you from the individual parties and then make a decision.
Right.
And the what I was recommending or suggesting or contemplating, this process contemplate, is to actually recognize that this does take place and to put some structure to it.
And structure would include the appointment maybe of a standing arbitrator?
Now, I will confess that I have not developed that concept to the level of detail and finality, because that's if this concept has merit, it would require a fair degree of thought. Largely because I think it's not going to be something that is going to be there is 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 individuals that can consistently represent a level of competence and expertise and wisdom on every one of these issues. It's more of a description of a process than it is to identify exactly how that model should work.
Thank you. Mr. Sato, as we all know, you were an active participant in the Fraser River panel while you were a member of DFO. And there is a document before us which you wrote in 2002 to the chairs of the Pacific Salmon Commission, expressing concern of the panel that DFO was not carrying out and fulfilling its obligations on stock enumeration to the level that you felt it was the government of Canada was obligated under the treaty. This document's already before us. You're familiar with what I'm talking about?
I am not familiar with the exact document. I am familiar, I am aware of the, I did participate or did author a letter of that nature sometime, but I'm not familiar with the exact contents.
In fairness,
I've not been warned of that, so to speak.
in fairness, then, that document should be put forward. I'm sorry, I have the exhibit number somewhere in my notes. Can I be assisted by the clerk? This is, here it is now in front of us, and it is exhibit number 386. 386. That actually is not the letter. It's this, yes, carried down to the bottom, please, Mr. Lund. Yes, you'll see your signature there. If you wish to read it first, and even before reading it, so you appreciate where I'm going with this, I'm wanting to elicit from you, after having expressed this concern, you remained with the Fraser River panel until 2005? Do I have that correctly?
The end, fall of 2004.
End of 2004. After you've read this letter, the question I will be asking you is, are you aware, subsequent to your concern as expressed in this letter, of continuing concerns regarding stock enumeration issues with DFO and whether it was carrying out its responsibilities? So why don't I allow you the time to briefly read that letter? Thank you. Having read that letter, can I assume that it's correct to suggest that you were obviously expressing concern of the Fraser River panel that DFO at that time, writing that letter, was not carrying out sufficiently the stock enumeration program that should have been carried out in compliance with the treaty?
Yes, I was fulfilling my role as the Canadian chair of the Fraser River panel, that there was a bilateral agreement or consensus that that stock assessment, the emphasis on stock assessment was not reaching expectations. Yes.
Yes. Do you have evidence to give to this inquiry whether that has been a continuing problem from your perspective?
I'm sorry, do I have evidence today?
Yeah. What is your what is your belief whether this problem has continued as a problem in terms of DFO not meeting its, what I'll call, treaty obligations?
That's a difficult question to answer, sir, because now, I can't speak for what the department has done specifically from the time I resigned or retired from the Department of Fisheries, but I do know that in response to a reduction in the level of intensity, for example, on pink salmon enumeration, that the Department of Fisheries have developed a more responsive in-season approach.
More what?
In-season approach. The Pacific Salmon Commission staff attached to the Fraser River panel and the Fraser River panel have taken and placed more emphasis on having larger resources directed at test fishing and other assessment methodologies, so they can get an assessment of what the run size is or returning abundance is of Fraser River pink salmon. So they've made that adaptation. Is it sufficient? I don't think I'm qualified, perhaps, to make that assessment. But traditionally, prior to 2002, or in those days when I was an employee of both the International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission as well as the Department of Fisheries, there was a fair dependence upon assessing the number of spawners or adults that spawned on the spawning grounds, hence the number of juveniles that emerged from the gravel in the spring, to give some sort of insight or forecast of the numbers of pink salmon that might be returning next year. When those programs were basically reduced or cut back, that shift, that adaptation took place. I would suggest that perhaps in other instances as well, the emphasis has been placed on in-season assessment, and I think that the Fraser River panel has made that adjustment. Is it adequate? Is it appropriate? I don't think I'm the person that should be responding to that.
Were you comfortable with the decision of DFO, I believe in 2004, to change the threshold for high precision enumeration at the spawning grounds from a 25,000 figure to 75,000 fish?
Struggling because these are not questions I was prepared for. I was.
That's unfortunately the nature of this process
All right,
sometimes.
that's fair enough, and
Thank you.
I'm presuming that it's. Presuming that's fine. When I was the chair of the Fraser River panel and that adjustment was made, it was in recognition and acknowledgement that with the diminishing resources and the competition for those same stock assessment resources for species other than, and populations of fish other than Fraser River sockeye, that some cuts or some adjustments needed to be made. I recall participating in those discussions with my colleagues in the Department of Fisheries, saying, is this a reasonable thing to do? And given the apparent rapid growth or expansion of sockeye populations throughout the watershed as a result of the rebuilding program or the escapement management program, that it was not unreasonable to contemplate then that many populations that were previously languishing at levels less than 25,000 were all of a sudden going to be returning in abundances or escapements in abundances in the 75,000 range. And so therefore the tagging programs, the intensive enumeration programs could reasonably respond to that. Was I satisfied with that? Well, on balance, it probably, as a manager and working with colleagues within the Department of Fisheries that also needed to conduct critical stock assessment programs for Chinook or coho or other populations, it was probably a reasonable accommodation. The better answer, perhaps, or the better solution would be to a general increase so that all programs could respond to what was considered to be minimal or acceptable levels, but you need to reach some balance sometimes.
But you recognize that the policy change obviously diminishes the quality of the data that is generated in terms of stock enumeration, obviously.
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Commissioner, Ms. Gartner was the first examiner, and after she completed her examination, some new documents were put to the witnesses, which she hasn't had an opportunity to raise with the witnesses, so she'd like to come back and deal with that.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. Brenda Gartner for the First Nations Coalition, and with me, Leah Pence. I just have a couple of questions on the ISDF. But before I do that, and with your leave, I have one question around the IHPC that Ms. Pence did not address with this panel when she finished with Pat Matthews, which we are going to pose to the panel this afternoon, and it just might be useful to hear from other representatives on the same committee at the same time for you. So I'm just going to ask one question on the IHPC and then turn to the ISDF. Now, IHPC, Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, Mr. Commissioner, and the makeup of that committee for the South Coast is slightly different than the North Coast. The makeup for the South Coast is 6 for the Commercial Sector Advisory Board and 3 from the Sports Fishing and 2 from the Marine Conservation. Presently, there's 4 positions for First Nations, and BC, as I understand, sits as ex officio. Is that just as an observer, Mr. Sato? Is that your role there?
It is, yes, it is largely observer role, but functionally there is no decision-making capacity per se on the part of the department of the province.
All right, and Mr. Christensen, this panel, or the IHPC is an advisory board. It doesn't provide decisions to the department. And as I understand, it is attempting to use a consensus approach, however struggling as that may be and however challenging that may be. It's consensus-based towards advice given to the ministry, or to the department. When looking at the challenges associated with First Nations representation there, and Mr. Commissioner has heard from Pat Matthews on that and all of you already, so we don't need to go over that part again, but perhaps more looking forward, into it. Assuming there was a functional Tier 1 and Tier 2 process, so that bilateral process with First Nations and DFO was actually functional, and we know we have to make that assumption because that's not in place yet. Would it be beneficial for the First Nations representative numbers there to become much more flexible and increase in number to get a broader range of interests and concerns? In relation to the numbers that are already there, doesn't, from my perspective, create a balance of there, even for the purposes of consensus. So would it make sense, perhaps, to take a much broader perspective on the types of geographical areas and gear types that First Nations also work with to provide a more flexible participation? I'd like your comments on that from both you, Mr. Christensen, and then Mr. Sadel.
Well, certainly, I'm happy to comment on that. I think that the numbers for each of the participating groups ought to be sufficient to ensure that that group is adequately and effectively represented. And in the case, for example, of the larger number for the commercial sector, when we were consulted about that, the recreational sector, we took the decision that we would not object to them having more representatives than us because it wasn't a voting forum. There have been other decision-making bodies where it was done by vote, and obviously then you don't want to be in a room where you are permanently outvoted. No, I would accept that. As I think I said in my direct testimony, this is a difficult problem for First Nations to deal with and for the department then to deal with. My hope is they can find a way to do that, and I think our sector would not object on the basis of numbers, if it was felt by First Nations that they needed more than 4. I would observe, though, that even with 4 seats, they're not always filled. And secondly, there has been, I think, at the committee, a sense of looking the other way in terms of representation. And so there have been people there who actually, I gather, have not been appointed, but who arrive at the meeting, sit at the table, speak to issues, and since it's consensus, there's no reason to vote. And as far as I'm aware, no one's presence or right to participate has ever been challenged at an IHPC meeting.
First of all, I would like to see the terms of reference for the IHPC, because I'm a little confused with respect to First Nations participation being limited or specified. Because as far as I can recall, at a recent South Coast meeting,
Page 3.
That's interesting, because I know that at recent meetings there have been typically, if you want to call it that, Mr. Marcel Shepherd, Mr. Pat Matthews, Mr. Don Hall, Mr. Errol Sam. I believe Johnson Straits First Nations have also been represented at these meetings. So
that's a combination of the South Coast and the North Coast. Then are we talking about that, or is that just the North? That's just the South?
Yes.
Okay.
And there was a time and a place where Chief Robert Hope, for example, representing Yale Band, was participating. So I think that the participation, as Dr. Christensen might have just best described, is that it is the IHPC process takes full advantage of opportunistic participation on the part of First Nations, I think.
So participation at this point is, we've talked already, and I don't want to go back into this, the challenges associated with mandated representation, but you're saying that if people show up for meetings, it's flexible and they're welcome to be there, that there's you don't hit those numbers and then people leave. You're happy to have them in that way. But if we were talking about the structuring these, improving the structures going forward, and as I said, if you assumed a Tier 1 and Tier 2 process was in place and functional, which is an assumption that we can make right now, it's not true, then with that in place, and we were trying to improve the value of the IHPC going forward, if we were looking at trying to create consensus amongst the groups in a more functional way, getting rid of the numbers of meetings and doing all those, you would welcome a higher participation in numbers by First Nations. Is that your evidence?
From my personal perspective,
from your perspective as the observer on behalf of the province? As the observer on behalf of the province,
the issue and the interest is not the numbers of people, but the sort of and the type of representation that does actually take place at these meetings.
Thank you. very much. Those are all the questions I had on the IHPC for now. Mr. Sato, I just wanted a couple questions with you on the ISDF. Mr. Commissioner, that's the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum that has been in place, I think, roughly since 2006, or some of its initial times, and it's being facilitated. I just wanted to be clear. I was trying to find this in the terms of reference and the documents that have been filed so far. This hasn't been understood. Mr. Sato, as you understand, First Nations participation at the beginning of this process and going into it have included an articulation of concerns that it's another multi-stakeholder process before the bilateral processes between First Nations and DFO are functional and in place, and that they had some concerns associated with coming to a multi-stakeholder group to negotiate their rights before having properly had the dialogue at a bilateral level. As I understand it, and I do believe Brenda McCorkadale will be coming to give evidence later in this hearing, and I wanted you to have an opportunity. As I understand it, there was some support at the beginning of the ISDF process for acknowledging that this bilateral process between First Nations and DFO was a necessary part of the governance or decision making, and then that was one of the premises or one of the principles. Maybe I'm not sure it's flexible language. I think that we might need to use here in the ISDF process. Could you comment on that?
My first reaction to your question is that I think this process would be much better served by speaking to the authors rather than to someone who's interpreting the document, and I'll simply leave it at that. But I think that the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum clearly recognized the value and the importance of participation by all the legitimate stakeholders and interests that have some ability to provide some sort of positive developments in this area here, and First Nations are absolutely key and critical, and ensuring that their participation in this process was not only a comfortable one, but one that that ensured that a lot of the concerns that they presently had then and will continue to have are not going to be affected or jeopardized by their participation in ISDF. I believe that the authors of the process, Mr. Sigurdsson and Stewart, made every attempt to ensure that comfort was there.
Sorry, I just need to be a little bit more precise on this. Thank you for that their participation was welcomed. But more specifically, their concern around these multi-stakeholder processes, their interest perhaps, of course, in them, but their concern that they were happening prior to a clear bilateral process with the department between First Nations and directly. And that they wanted this process in some ways to recognize that was going to be an important component of moving forward, and that was something this process, the ISDF process, could actually work with. It was something that you could encourage and you could actually work with, and that it would be valuable to have.
I was busy shuffling around to see if I could actually find that framework document that I referred to or was introduced, and there is a passage specifically in there that I believe that I would like to draw your attention to, but I'm
That's great. It's Exhibit 393, and I'm happy to take that to you. I'm sorry, I could actually, would you like to have a hard copy of the document?
Okay.
Would that be helpful to you?
Yes, but that's not the document.
There's 3 parts of it. Oh, he wants the framework. Yeah. 392, Exhibit 392. Is this the one you were looking for, Mr. Siddle?
This is.
And would you like Mr. Lund to scroll down? It may be around page 7.
I think it was in the area of page 7. I'm perhaps I can turn the question around to you and say, is there something here that suggests that First Nation interests and needs will not be protected?
No, not at all, Mr. Sato, and that's not the question or even the place from which I'm asking the question.
All right.
It's really, it's more one of the challenges in governance or decision-making structures right now, as you're aware, is having enough time and resources to do everything that's necessary to be done.
Yes.
And similarly, another challenge, I think, is that we all dream of a government that we likely can't afford, which is a complement to that. But one of the constitutional obligations, as you're aware, that the federal government has is as it relates to Section 35 rights and the constitutional obligations with First Nations, and that's an important part of the dialogue and the movement forward in governance. And First Nations, when called upon to attend to these multi-stakeholder groups, often, and I believe with the ISDF, raise the concern that as a complement to these multi-stakeholders, there must be a bilateral functional, what I call a Tier 1, Tier 2, and you're familiar with that process, that clearly allows them to have the government-to-government relationship with the federal crown that they have in law and needs to be exercised and practiced.
Yes.
And so what I'm asking you is, to your knowledge, and I don't believe this is in the documents, Mr. Sato, and that's why I'm asking you orally on this. I don't believe that it's in the documents, but to our knowledge, it's our understanding that the ISDF is supportive of ensuring that that bilateral process is in place in order to make multi-stakeholder processes more functional. Is that your working knowledge?
That is my knowledge. I still recommend that some opportunity to address that question directly to the authors is probably of value as well.
Yeah, or other participants that have been involved, and I'm happy to do that. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to speak on it as we move forward with this. And the other two other topics on the ISDF that I wanted to raise. One is, from First Nations perspective, it's not clear either in the process itself or in how it's being implemented, what role, if any, does the ISDF have in present decision-making processes? Are they advisory? How is their work incorporated into the actual decision-making process that is presently in place for Fraser River sockeye salmon?
I'm sorry, you're asking that question of me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Well, in my understanding, the Integrated Salmon Dialogue Forum does not have a direct role in the pre-season planning process or in season, but rather that they have provided some advice, for example, in the form of a document speaking about and referencing the importance of catch monitoring, establishing catch monitoring standards and fishery monitoring and catch reporting standards that are of some support, that gathered the support of the commercial, the recreational, and First Nations fisheries, and also describes the fishery monitoring and catch reporting practices in a manner that enables everyone to have a thorough and supportive understanding of each other's fishery monitoring and catch reporting practices. That is one form that where the monitoring and compliance panel of the ISDF has performed and provided that level of service to the salmon fishery.
Thank you. I understand Mr. Sack is going to speak to us this afternoon just on some of that initiative, and so I'll pick that up with, or we'll pick that up with him later. Just finally, do you know how this ISDF is funded? Who's funding it and who's paying for the facilitators, and from what budget is it coming from? Do you know any of that kind of information?
No, that is probably a question that is more appropriately asked of the Department of Fisheries.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
If I may, it is my understanding that the funding has come through what's called PICFI, because I know that only because when I was directed, that's the source that was cited to me when I asked where would I send my expense claim for participation.
And you're going to hear lots about PICFI as we go forward, Mr. Commissioner, so I'll leave it at that. But I think it is important for you to know that now, and that was the purpose for the question. It's useful to know that this process is being funded under the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fishing Initiative. Oh, I made it right through that, an acronym. That's very good. And First Nations, of course, will have much to say about that to you and during the Aboriginal panel.
I also, and I realize you didn't ask the question of me, but as someone who has participated in,
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware you were
ISDF from the beginning,
sorry.
I wanted to address the key question you were asking of Wayne Saito, and that is, it is has been my experience that this question of the relationship between what ISDF is trying to accomplish and the first and second tier work of First Nations has been, explicitly talked about within the ISDF and recognized. I can personally recall discussions of this by Brenda McCorkle-Dale, by Mark Diven, and by others, sometimes with differences between them as to how those things should be worked out. But that I think that while I have, as I was in my testimony, am not perhaps as positive in my view of the ISDF as is Wayne, I think that this is one area where the ISDF has made every effort to be respectful of those issues and to try and ensure that the discussions that were taking place between us as interests about whether it was catch monitoring or the governance process were only done in the context of recognizing that First Nations have constitutional rights, which they which they need to pursue in their own way in first and second tier, and that we should not interfere with that or make it more difficult.
And in fact, your process could be improved if there was a functional bilateral process.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I have just one re-examination point, and then I think we can thank this panel for their time. Mr. Saito, Mr. Rosenblum took you to a document, Exhibit 386, and I just need to go back to that for a moment. And he took you to the letter that you had signed with the U.S. chair. And when he asked you questions about funding for stock assessment, in your responses you referred to changes that were made to pink salmon enumeration. And I just wanted to identify at the first page of this letter, there's 5 bullet points set out. And the first bullet sets out concerns about summer run sockeye, upriver escapement assessment programs. The next bullet talks about elimination of sockeye escapement programs. The third one is pink salmon escapement programs. And the fourth one is about pink salmon. And the final bullet is again about Fraser River sockeye programs. So in your responses, you seem to focus only on the changes that were made to pink salmon escapement. Jerry, did the Fraser River panel in your time as Canadian chair have concerns about Fraser River sockeye enumeration resourcing as set out in this letter?
Yes, they did, and I apologize if I misdirected my response to focus on pink salmon. I was using pink salmon to illustrate the issues, and that yes, there was a reduction, but that adaptation per se was taking place with respect to sockeye as well as to pink salmon.
All right. Well, did the concerns that are identified in this letter, which can you show me the date, Mr. Lunn? I think it's 2003, but I'm not sure.
Yes.
2003. The concerns expressed in this letter, first of all, were they addressed with vis-a-vis Fraser River sockeye?
When you ask were they addressed, are you suggesting was funding restored?
Yes.
No, funding was not restored.
And
to the best of my knowledge, and I do not know what happened after I retired from the department.
And so the concerns that you outlined here in 2003, were those concerns still alive in 2004 when you were still the chair of the Canadian chair of the panel?
Yes, they were.
Okay, thank you. That's my questions. Mr. Commissioner, I think that's the end of questions for this panel, and maybe we could take the break and come back with the second decision-making panel. And thank you very much for attending.
I apologize. I'm getting so used to seeing your faces around, I forget to thank you for your attendance, but I do want to sincerely express the appreciation of the Commission for the fact that, as Mr. Rosenblum pointed out, you have been here more than one day, even though time flies by. We mustn't forget that it's an intrusion into your lives. So thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us and for answering the questions of all of the participants, Council and the participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will be, of course, back again in March, so you haven't got rid of me yet.
Thank you for the reminder.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.